Hey friends, tonight we're stepping away from the well-known myths and into the quieter stories, tales of the forgotten heroes of ancient Greece. Their names may not be famous, but their paths are just as rich, full of bravery, loss, and quiet triumph. If you enjoy these calm journeys through the ancient world, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And if a name in tonight's story stands out to you, tell us in the comments, what did you like or dislike about it? But enough of that. It's time to get comfortable. Let your thoughts slow down, listen to the lyre slowly fade into the Aegean, and let the stories do the rest. There's a saying in ancient Greece that goes something like this. The winds of fate blow for everyone, but for some, they come with a bit more flair. And if anyone embodied this idea, it was Zetes, the son of Boreas, the mighty north wind. You see, while most heroes had to rely on their strength, wits, or weapons to stand out, Zetes had something a little more windy. The ability to fly. Yes, you heard that correctly. He could actually fly, and not just like those dainty, half-hearted attempts we see in mythological stories with poorly drawn wings. Zetes had wings like the north wind itself, strong, fast, and a bit of a show-off. Imagine being the kind of guy who could show up to a battle, swoop in, and swoosh past your enemies faster than they could blink. Zetes and his brother Calais, who shared his divine heritage, were the ultimate air force of their time. These two winged wonders didn't need horses or chariots to travel. They just spread their wings and whoosh, off they went, faster than any mortal could follow. But let's be real. Being the sons of a god of the north wind has its ups and downs. On the upside, flying like a bird is super cool, and really handy when you need to escape a sticky situation. On the downside, though, you have absolutely no control over how fast you can go. Zetes, who was used to moving faster than a chariot race on steroids, often found himself in situations where he accidentally left people behind, or blasted through things with the force of a storm. Imagine being so fast that even your friends can't keep up. Awkward, right? Still, this high-speed lifestyle didn't slow Zetes down one bit. As the son of Boreas, he was also naturally strong and fierce, a deadly combination. He wasn't just fast, he was tough. He'd grown up in the mountains of Thrace, where the winds were often as cold as his temper. And that fiery, stormy nature came in handy when he was chosen to join the legendary crew of the Argonauts, led by none other than Jason, the man with the golden fleece obsession. When Jason called upon the bravest of Greece to help him obtain the golden fleece, Zetes and his brother Calais couldn't resist the allure of another grand adventure. Flying to distant lands, fighting monsters, outrunning gods, count them in. What Zetes and Calais didn't quite expect, however, was just how much trouble their incredible speed would bring. The thing about flying super fast is that you sometimes miss a lot of the details. You might zoom past something important, or in the case of Zetes, you might accidentally offend a few deities. And while the gods might be okay with the occasional mortal offending them, because, let's face it, it happens daily, Zetes didn't quite learn early on that when you're faster than the north wind, you might step on a few divine toes along the way. But Zetes wasn't the kind of guy to back down from a challenge, especially when the reward was a golden fleece and eternal fame. Along with his brother Calais, who was just as speed-crazed as him, Zetes would eventually face trials that tested not only his speed and strength, but also the limits of his impulsive nature. And thus, armed with his wings and the gift of speed, Zetes was ready to dive headfirst into the world of gods, monsters, and of course, a quest for a golden fleece that was way cooler than anything any mortal could ever hope to achieve. But little did he know, some of the creatures they'd face were about to learn firsthand that messing with the sons of Boreas was a lot like messing with the tornado. It wasn't a good idea. As the Argonauts set sail on their quest for the Golden Fleece, Zetes and his brother Calais quickly became indispensable members of the team. Not just because they could fly, but because of the way their speed gave the Argonauts a significant edge over both natural and supernatural threats. They were the Argonauts' scouts, always able to outrun danger and reach places no one else could. At the beginning of the journey, when the Argo was still adjusting to the unfamiliar seas and the pressure of the quest, Zetes and Calais took to the skies, scouting ahead to ensure the safety of the crew. It wasn't long before Zetes found himself having a bit of fun with his newfound freedom. Flying over forests, mountains and valleys, he would swoop down with the wind at his back, showing off for the crew below. His light-hearted antics were met with chuckles from his fellow Argonauts, who marvelled at the sight of the brothers soaring through the sky, their wings gleaming in the sun. However, not all of Zetes' flights were as carefree as he might have liked. With great speed comes great responsibility, and it didn't take long for Zetes to realise that there were dangers on the horizon, literal and figurative, that he couldn't simply outrun. The first significant challenge came when the Argonauts reached the island of Phineus, the blind prophet. Phineus had been cursed by the gods, tormented by the Harpies, hideous winged creatures sent to plague him. The Harpies would steal Phineus's food and torment him, leaving him unable to live in peace. It was Zetes and Calais, with their speed and wings, who were tasked with helping the prophet. When they arrived on Phineus's island, the Harpies were there, swooping down to steal the prophet's food as always. Zetes, with his quick reflexes and ability to fly, was perfectly suited for this task. As the Harpies descended, he and his brother dove into action, flying circles around the creatures, cutting off their escape routes and driving them away. Zetes, full of youthful energy, couldn't help but enjoy the chase, weaving and dodging through the skies as the Harpies screeched in frustration. It was like a high-speed chase, but with monsters. The Harpies, unable to keep up with the brothers' speed, were forced to flee, leaving Phineus free from his torment. His gratitude was immense, but Zetes, still flying circles around the island in celebration, had to be reminded that the Harpies weren't gone for good. They would be back. "Next time, let's not leave them a chance to regroup," Zetes said with a grin. He was, after all, a creature of speed and action, not always one to consider the long-term consequences. It was in moments like these that Zetes' impulsive nature got the best of him. He could see the immediate benefit of acting fast, but often failed to realise that the long-term impact of his actions needed more thought. His giddy enthusiasm often led him into situations where his power was an asset, but it also made him prone to leaving things half done, or letting his speed get ahead of his better judgment. Despite his sometimes reckless behaviour, Zetes continued to be a vital asset to the Argonauts. His ability to fly helped the group evade numerous dangers, and when it came to situations that required speed and precision, Zetes was the first to be called upon. But the gods, as always, had their own plans, and while Zetes believed that his speed and wings would always be enough to keep him ahead of the game, he would soon discover that even the fastest hero couldn't outrun fate forever. The quest for the Golden Fleece had brought the Argonauts to the edge of the world, with many dangers still ahead. After dealing with the Harpies, the crew had grown more confident, knowing that the gods and monsters they faced could be overcome with speed, strength, and strategy. But even Zetes, with his extraordinary gift of flight, was starting to realise that there were forces in the world that no one could outrun, not even the mighty sons of Boreas. The first signs that Zetes' speed might not be enough came when the Argonauts reached the shores of Colchis, the land where the Golden Fleece was kept. The city was heavily guarded, both by Ares' dragon and by a series of divine and mortal challenges designed to test anyone who sought the fleece. Jason had come with a plan, relying on Medea's magic and the strength of his warriors, but Zetes, ever the optimist, believed that their most pressing problem was the dragon. Surely, he thought, no creature could match his speed. But the dragon was a different kind of enemy, one that wasn't so easily outflown. Zetes, in his typical impulsive style, decided to fly ahead to scout the dragon's position before the Argonauts attempted to steal the Golden Fleece. He zoomed through the skies, his wings cutting through the air like a streak of lightning. He could see the dragon guarding the fleece, its massive serpentine body coiled around the tree, its eyes glowing like molten gold. But Zetes' speed got the better of him. He moved so fast that he barely noticed the sudden shift in the wind, a sign that the gods were intervening once again. Zeus, ever fond of setting mortals on paths of trials, had decided that Zetes needed a lesson in humility. As Zetes dove low to inspect the dragon, the winds shifted, and what seemed like an open, unguarded position turned into a trap. The dragon, sensing the disturbance in the air, hissed and reared back, launching a sudden strike. Zetes, flying at breakneck speed, wasn't prepared for this shift in momentum. He narrowly dodged the dragon's attack, but in doing so, he collided with a mystical barrier, one of the divine traps set by Zetes, the king of Colchis. "Wait, you didn't see that coming?" Zetes muttered to himself, a bit too flustered to think clearly. He had zoomed right into it, thinking his speed would be enough to avoid all dangers, but now, with the dragon's roar echoing through the air, Zetes found himself unable to outfly the situation. The dragon had been roused, and now it was time for the Argonauts to fight, not run. As the Argonauts charged forward, Jason and Medea leading the charge, Zetes realized that his impulsive speed was not always the solution to their problems. He had been so used to running ahead of everyone that he had forgotten to account for the larger picture. The dragon, despite being an enemy of incredible power, could be overcome with the right strategy, but not with brute force or speed alone. I should have waited, Zetes muttered to himself, realizing that while flying at lightning speed had its advantages, it was also a dangerous approach when dealing with enemies who didn't just rely on physical power. Sometimes the key to success wasn't about getting there first, but strategizing with your team and adapting to the challenges ahead. But Zetes' realization came too late for him to undo the damage. The dragon had already sensed the presence of the Argonauts, and was now on full alert. Zetes was able to use his flight to distract the creature and draw its attention away from Jason, but the battle that followed proved that no one was invincible. Even his unmatched speed couldn't save him from the fury of a creature protected by divine magic. The Argonauts had to fight as a unit, using their combined strength and strategy to subdue the dragon. When the dust finally settled, Zetes found himself nursing a bruised ego and a newly sharpened sense of humility. The gods, he realized, didn't like it when mortals thought they could outsmart fate with their speed and power. There were trials ahead that couldn't be avoided by simply flying faster than everyone else. His impulsive nature had brought him face to face with the consequences of thinking too highly of his own abilities, and now, more than ever, he understood that sometimes the greatest heroes were those who learned when to slow down and think. After the encounter with the dragon, and the realization that his impulsive nature had nearly undone their chances of success, Zetes found himself in an unfamiliar position, doubting his own abilities. For much of his life, his speed had been his greatest asset. Flying faster than anyone had always been enough to solve problems, but now, with the golden fleece within reach, Zetes understood that there were challenges in this world that even his wings couldn't help him conquer. As the Argonauts made their way through the labyrinthine temple of Ares, preparing for the final attempt to retrieve the golden fleece, Zetes began to reflect on his journey and the mistakes he had made. He had always been the one to act first, often charging headfirst into danger without thinking of the consequences. His ability to fly had made him feel invincible, but now, in the face of divine trials, he could see that brute force and speed weren't enough to guarantee victory. His mind raced with self-doubt as he watched the other Argonauts prepare for what would be their final battle. Jason, calm and determined, was strategizing with Medea on how they would confront the dragon, using her magic and his leadership to make the best of the situation. Heracles, ever the warrior, was sharpening his weapons, ready to engage in physical combat. Meanwhile, Orpheus played his lyre softly, his music calming the tension in the air. Each of the Argonauts had their own role to play, and Zetes began to wonder where he fit into all of this. As the group settled into their positions, preparing for the confrontation with the dragon, Zetes stepped away from the others, seeking some solitude. He took to the skies, hovering above the camp, the wind rushing through his feathers. As he soared higher, his thoughts became more chaotic, his doubts swirling like the winds he controlled. I was so sure of myself, he thought. I thought I could solve everything just by flying faster, by being the quickest. But what if speed isn't the answer? What if it's more about patience, strategy, and the ability to think rather than just move? He looked down at the Argonauts below. They were preparing to face the dragon, a creature that even Heracles couldn't easily defeat. The fleece was guarded by not just physical strength, but divine power. Zetes knew he couldn't rely solely on his ability to fly. He needed to be part of the team, to support Jason, Medea, and the others in ways that went beyond just rushing in. In that moment, he made a decision. He would change his approach. Instead of flying off to face the danger alone, he would work with the group, using his abilities in a way that complemented their strengths. Zetes realized that sometimes, even the greatest of heroes had to adapt, to recognize that speed and strength alone wouldn't win the day. It was about working together, respecting each person's role in the larger picture. When the time came for the final confrontation with the dragon, Zetes was no longer the reckless speedster who had rushed into battle with little thought. This time, he used his ability to fly to distract the dragon. weaving around it with precision, guiding its attention away from Jason and Medea. His wings became the perfect tool for creating openings and providing the team with opportunities. Zetes didn't need to outrun the dragon or defeat it himself. Instead, he was there to make sure the team had the best chance to succeed, working in tandem with the others. With the help of Medea's magic and Jason's strategy, the dragon was finally defeated, and the Golden Fleece was within their grasp. As Zetes landed back beside his fellow Argonauts, he felt a sense of pride not in his speed, but in his role as part of the team. For the first time in his journey, he understood that heroism wasn't just about the individual. It was about working together and accepting the strength that came from the unity of the group. After the Golden Fleece was secured and the dragon defeated, the Argonauts began their journey back home, their mission accomplished. The fleece, the symbol of divine power, had been reclaimed. The winds of fortune now seemed to blow favourably for the heroes, and their triumph was undeniable. However, for Zetes, the true victory had already been won long before the fleece was placed safely in their hands. It was in those final moments when the group stood victorious after overcoming their greatest challenges that Zetes realised something profound. He had grown, not just as a hero, but as a person. No longer did he view the world through the lens of speed and flight alone. He understood now that heroism wasn't just about quick reflexes or outdistancing others. It was about working with others, understanding when to act alone and when to support. During their return journey, Zetes had taken a more active role in making decisions alongside Jason and the rest of the Argonauts. He had earned their respect not just through his abilities, but through his ability to adapt and see the bigger picture. When the group faced dangerous waters or encountered monsters on their way home, Zetes used his flying abilities to scout ahead, yes, but he also consulted with the group. He was no longer the one who rushed ahead in a storm of wind and reckless speed. Instead, he was a crucial part of the team, advising, strategizing, and providing solutions rather than just charging in head first. One of the key moments of Zetes' transformation came when the Argonauts encountered the Sirens, the temptresses, whose songs could lead sailors to their doom. Many heroes had fallen victim to their bewitching melodies, but Zetes, now more attuned to his limitations and the strength of the group, suggested a different tactic. Instead of rushing ahead to fight the Sirens, he recommended that they focus on blocking out their song, using the skills of Orpheus, the group's musician. The team, led by Orpheus, played their own music, so powerful that it drowned out the Sirens' seductive calls. Zetes, whose flying speed had often been his solution to every problem, now understood that sometimes wisdom and strategy were more powerful than speed alone. As they sailed back, Zetes spent more time reflecting on his role within the Argonauts, his wings no longer merely a tool for escape or conquest, but part of a more balanced approach to heroism. He had learned that the journey wasn't just about reaching the destination. It was about the growth and connections made along the way. He had at last accepted that he couldn't fly away from the consequences of his past choices. Yet, despite his internal transformation, Zetes still faced a poignant realization. The Argonauts were not invincible, and no matter how much he had learned, there were still forces beyond his control. The gods, who had helped them to success, would not be content to let the heroes return to their homes without one last trial. As the crew neared their destination, the winds shifted once more, and Zetes could feel that their journey was far from over. He understood now that no matter how much he had learned, the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. Zetes' role in the Argonauts' quest was not only pivotal in the physical sense, but also in terms of the team's emotional growth. His transformation from the reckless, speed-driven hero to a strategic, team-oriented figure mirrored the group's collective maturation. Zetes had come to realize that the real strength of a hero is not in how fast they can act, but in how well they can adapt to the needs of their team and the situation at hand. In the aftermath of the Golden Fleece's return to Iolcus, Zetes was no longer remembered simply for his winged speed. He was celebrated for his wisdom, humility, and dedication to the team. His legacy, like that of many of the Argonauts, was one of growth, balance, and the understanding that heroism was not just about victories, but also about how one learns from their flaws. When the Argonauts finally returned to Iolcus, the city that had sent them on their legendary quest for the Golden Fleece, they were met with a hero's welcome. Songs were sung, feasts were held, and the golden fleece was placed in its rightful place, a symbol of victory over both mortal and divine challenges. Jason and Medea, as the masterminds behind the quest, were naturally celebrated, but in the aftermath of their victory, something important was also recognised. The true heroes of the journey were not just those with the loudest weapons or the most impressive feats, they were also the ones who had learned from their mistakes and adapted to the challenges in front of them. Among these heroes was Zetes. No longer the reckless, fast-flying warrior who relied solely on his speed, Zetes had evolved into a more self-aware, collaborative hero. His ability to fly, once his defining trait, had transformed into just one piece of his character. He had learned that acting with the team, using his strengths to support others rather than charging in alone, made him a more powerful ally. His impulsive nature, once a liability, had been tempered by the wisdom he gained on his journey, and this made him all the more valuable to the Argonauts. While Zetes' name wasn't sung as often as Heracles' or Jason's, it was still spoken with respect. He had been one of the unsung heroes of the quest, not because of a lack of power, but because his strength lay in his ability to adapt and support his teammates when they needed him most. His legacy wasn't about winning battles or defeating monsters, it was about learning to slow down when the moment called for it, to think before acting, and to understand that true heroism was often more about patience and teamwork than rushing into things head first. As the Argonauts went their separate ways, Zetes returned to Thrace, where he became a figure of wisdom in his own right. He was not just the son of Boreas, he was a man who had lived through the trials of the quest, who had experienced firsthand the consequences of unchecked speed and impulse. His wisdom became known far and wide, and he was often called upon by other heroes for counsel, particularly in matters of strategy, teamwork and self-discipline. In the years that followed, Zetes became a mentor to the younger generation of heroes, teaching them that the path to greatness wasn't always about being the fastest or the strongest. It was about learning from mistakes, embracing your strengths, and knowing when to act as part of a team. He wasn't a god or a demigod, but his story lived on as an example of how humility and self-awareness could elevate a hero beyond the surface level of glory and strength. Even the gods, who had once tested him with their trials, came to respect Zetes in their own way. Zeus, the king of the gods, watched from his throne as Zetes matured into a true hero, not through divine favour, but through the choices he made. Zetes had learned the ultimate lesson. Speed and strength were only part of the story. The gods had gifted him wings, but it was his choice to grow, to learn, and to adapt that made him truly legendary. Did you know that ancient Greek ships, while not exactly known for their luxury, had an intricate system of navigation based largely on the stars? While today we may rely on GPS or Google Maps, Greek sailors used the night sky to guide their way, trusting in the constellations to lead them through the turbulent waters of the Mediterranean. One of the greatest challenges, however, wasn't just the navigation, it was the constant threat of storms that could wipe out entire fleets in a matter of hours. This constant battle with the elements was especially felt during the infamous Trojan War, when even the mightiest heroes found their fate tied to the whims of the gods and the unpredictability of the sea. Among those caught in this conflict was Idomeneus, a king whose story, though often overshadowed by the likes of Achilles and Odysseus, carried with it a tragedy of its own. Born on the island of Crete, Idomeneus was the son of Deucalion, the king of Crete, and a descendant of Minos, the legendary ruler who trapped the Minotaur in his labyrinth. Crete, during Idomeneus' time, was more than just a rocky island in the middle of the Aegean. It was the heart of a civilization that excelled in trade, art, and innovation. But no matter how powerful a kingdom might be, no amount of wealth or grandeur could ever protect it from the unpredictable tides of fate. Idomeneus grew up in the shadow of the legendary Minos, tasked with maintaining the grandeur of the Minoan Empire. But while Minos had built a kingdom of mythic proportions, Idomeneus found his own path on the battlefield rather than the throne room. As a young man, he was no stranger to the harsh realities of leadership. He knew that power, though powerful, could also be fragile, easily swept away by the chaos of war. And when the call to arms came for the Greek world to unite against the city of Troy, Idomeneus could hardly refuse. Duty called, and he was ready to answer. For Idomeneus, the war wasn't just about the glory of battle. It was about honouring the traditions of his people, and, more importantly, keeping the honour of his royal lineage intact. He gathered his forces, donned his armour, and prepared to leave the shores of Crete. It wasn't just the fate of his island at stake, it was his legacy. His forces, though smaller than those of some of the other Greek leaders, were well trained and fiercely loyal. Under his command, the Cretan warriors were known for their discipline and bravery. But little did Idomeneus know, as he sailed from the shores of Crete, that his journey would not only be a test of his military skill, but also of his moral strength. The gods, as always, had their own plans. The Trojan War was no ordinary conflict. It was the kind of war that reshaped the course of history, where gods interfered as often as mortals, and where heroes rose to prominence on the battlefield not just for their courage, but also for their wit and the favour of the divine. As the war raged on, the Greek army found itself relying on every ounce of its strength and resourcefulness, and one leader in particular would emerge as a central figure, Idomeneus, king of Crete. Idomeneus had entered the war not just as a warrior but as a king, a leader with a heavy crown to carry and an even heavier responsibility. While the other Greek commanders were well known and had achieved legendary status in their own right, Achilles for his near invincibility, Odysseus for his cunning, and Agamemnon for his authority, Idomeneus carved out his own reputation, mostly through the strength of his leadership and battlefield prowess. What set Idomeneus apart, however, wasn't just his skill in combat, though he was no slouch with a sword. It was his ability to lead his men through some of the most difficult and dangerous situations. Throughout the 10 long years of the Trojan War, Idomeneus consistently proved that he was not just a soldier, but a commander who understood the larger strategies of war. He was a tactician, often called upon by Agamemnon to lead critical battles or to take charge of difficult positions. While Achilles' rage and Hector's bravery were known to everyone, Idomeneus earned the respect of his peers by keeping his cool under pressure. His men followed him not because of his bloodline or his fame, but because of his calm and unshakable presence. In the midst of chaos, when Greek warriors were charging into battle or retreating in confusion, Idomeneus remained focused, issuing orders and making decisions that kept his forces intact. His leadership in such dire situations made him a cornerstone of the Greek army. The battle that solidified Idomeneus' place in the annals of Greek history came during one of the fiercest encounters in the Trojan War. In what is known as the Battle of the Ships, the Trojans launched a relentless assault on the Greek fleet, hoping to destroy it before the Greeks could even think about returning home. It was a situation of absolute peril, as the ships were crucial to their escape, and the Trojans seemed determined to set the entire fleet ablaze. At this moment of crisis, Idomeneus stepped forward. With the tide of battle threatening to turn against the Greeks, he rallied his warriors, leading them into the heart of the fray. His courage and sheer will to protect the fleet inspired the men under his command to fight with renewed vigour. It wasn't just the Greeks' superior weaponry or armour that saved them, but Idomeneus' leadership in the face of annihilation. He understood that battles were not won merely by brute strength, but by unity and purpose. As a result, the Greeks managed to turn the tide of the battle, forcing the Trojans to retreat. But even in the heat of victory, Idomeneus faced challenges that went beyond the battlefield. While his warriors respected him, they began to notice that his unrelenting focus on victory, his almost obsessive pursuit of honour, was starting to take a toll. Idomeneus would often place the welfare of his soldiers above his own well-being, pushing himself to exhaustion for the sake of the greater cause. And while his men admired his tenacity, some began to question whether a king could truly lead without first protecting himself. However, the gods had their own ideas about Idomeneus' fate. Like many heroes of the Trojan War, his destiny wasn't entirely his to control. Poseidon, the god of the sea and protector of sailors, seemed to favour Idomeneus, granting him protection during many of his voyages. But even Poseidon's favour couldn't shield him from the more unpredictable forces of the divine. With the gods watching from above, ready to intervene at any moment, Idomeneus' journey was already being shaped by forces he could neither understand nor escape. The Trojan War had stretched on for nearly a decade. The gods, ever meddlesome in the affairs of mortals, seemed as though they were amused by the spectacle of the Greeks and Trojans, each side believing it had the divine favour, only to be betrayed by their own weaknesses and overconfidence. For Idomeneus, the war had become a stage not just for battle but for internal conflict. His leadership had been tested, his courage proven, and his men had come to rely on him. But now, A moment was approaching that would challenge him in ways he'd never anticipated. As the Greeks were making their final push against Troy, the tension in the camp grew thick with exhaustion. The once grand ambitions of quickly conquering the city had long faded into an interminable struggle, where every victory felt hollow and every setback pushed them further into despair. The Greek fleet had suffered heavy losses, and the ships, which had once seemed like a symbol of their strength, now appeared more like a looming reminder of their frailty. It was during this moment of frustration, when both the Greeks and Trojans were locked in a standstill, that a twist of fate would change everything for Idomeneus. After a particularly grueling skirmish outside the city walls, Idomeneus found himself standing with Agamemnon, Odysseus, and several other commanders. The conversation was tense, the mood heavy with the burden of prolonged war. The question was simple but profound. Should they push forward and risk everything for a final assault, or should they consider retreat? The Trojans were weakened but still formidable. A retreat, though, would be seen as a failure, a dishonour that could never be erased. It was a decision that would test not just their military resolve, but their very sense of identity as Greeks. Idomeneus, as always, argued for an aggressive stance. The island of Crete, after all, was not known for cowering in fear. He had led his men into battle with relentless resolve, and his belief was simple: if they fought harder, they would win. But the other leaders, weary from years of conflict, began to voice doubts. Odysseus, ever the pragmatist, pointed out the danger of continuing at such a cost, while Agamemnon warned of the possibility of divine punishment should they push too far. And then the gods, who had long been lurking in the background of the war, decided to make their presence felt. The sky darkened, and a sudden storm rolled over the Greeks' camp, as if to underscore the uncertainty of their fate. It was a sign, or perhaps a test. Poseidon, Idomeneus' divine protector, had granted him favour before, but in this moment even the god of the sea seemed distant. Apollo, another god with a vested interest in the outcome of the war, sent a prophetic message to the Greek leaders. It was cryptic but clear. The one who sacrifices the most will be the one who bears the heaviest burden. It was a warning Idomeneus took personally. To him, it was clear. He would lead his men, no matter the cost. He would carry the weight of his people, his kingdom, and his honour. But in the midst of this resolve, a choice had to be made, one that would alter the course of Idomeneus' life. The storm raged on for hours, and with it, the gods' voices grew louder. Eventually, Idomeneus was forced to make a fateful vow. I will sacrifice the first living being I see when I return to Crete, if only the gods would spare our fleet. It was a promise born out of desperation, a call to the gods in exchange for salvation. His words echoed through the camp like a prayer, but the cost of the vow was not immediately apparent. When the storm subsided, Idomeneus felt the weight of his promise. It wasn't just the loss of his men or his fleet at stake anymore, it was his very soul. But as always, the Greeks were quick to reassure him, focused solely on the task ahead. Troy was near defeat, and the gods would favour them in the final push. Idomeneus had no way of knowing that, in making that promise, he had already sealed his fate. The moment he uttered those words, he unwittingly set into motion a tragic chain of events that would follow him for the rest of his days. The gods may have spared his fleet, but the price would be far greater than he could imagine. The winds of fate, though seemingly invisible, were as powerful as the seas that Idomeneus had crossed countless times. Having made his vow to the gods, Idomeneus believed at first that it would be an act of duty, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. After all, the gods had spared his fleet. The war was nearing its end, and the Greeks were on the brink of victory. Surely a simple offering to the gods in exchange for such salvation would be a small price to pay, right? But as the days passed and the journey home continued, the reality of his vow began to weigh heavily on his mind. Idomeneus had always been a man of honour, a man whose word was as unbreakable as the walls of his royal palace. He had always believed that duty to the gods and to his kingdom was paramount, but now, as the shores of Crete began to emerge on the horizon, he began to question the nature of that duty. The very gods who had granted him favour now seemed more like cruel architects of a fate he had no control over. His thoughts were plagued by doubt. What had he done? His mind, once as sharp as the sword he wielded in battle, now felt clouded with guilt. The first living thing he saw upon returning home, what if it was a child? What if it was someone he loved? How could he possibly fulfill the vow? The more he thought about it, the more he realized the terrible truth. His vow was no mere sacrifice of livestock or spoils of war. It was the sacrifice of something precious. It could be a person, a life. As the fleet sailed closer to Crete, Idomeneus found himself staring out into the horizon, unable to shake the grim thought that he had sealed his own fate. What if the gods demanded the ultimate sacrifice? What if his vow meant something darker than he had imagined? Would he have to sacrifice his own daughter? The thought was unbearable, but the possibility gnawed at him. It was here, in the solitude of his cabin, that Idomeneus wrestled with his inner turmoil. The cries of his men, celebrating the end of their long voyage, seemed distant to him now. They were too caught up in the excitement of their victory to understand the true cost of what had just transpired. But Idomeneus knew the stakes. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was different. This wasn't a challenge on the battlefield. This was a test of his very soul. His mind began to flash back to his days as a young prince, raised in the courts of Crete under the watchful eye of his father. He remembered the lessons of duty, of the importance of leadership. Duty before all else. He had been taught that from an early age. He had always been willing to sacrifice for the good of his people, but now the line between duty and personal loss seemed blurry. Could he really uphold his vow without sacrificing his humanity? Could he sacrifice his own flesh and blood for the sake of honour? The gods were fickle, unpredictable in their favour. One moment they bestowed blessings, the next curses. Idomeneus knew better than most that the gods did not care for mortal suffering. They cared only for their own whims. But could a man like him, one who had always acted with honour, choose to break such a solemn vow? He thought of his daughter, Hippodamia, the child he loved more than anything. Her laughter echoed in his mind, the sound of innocence he could not bear to tarnish. And yet, the gods had seen fit to test him. The sacrifice he had promised, once a simple gesture to ensure survival, had now become a nightmare. He had to choose, keep his word to the gods, or defy the very promise he had made. As the ship neared the harbour, the weight of his decision became unbearable. He could not face it. He could not betray his daughter, nor could he betray his kingdom by going back on his word. The tension in his heart was a tempest more violent than any storm he had weathered at sea. And so, as the fleet dropped anchor and the soldiers began to disembark, Idomeneus stood still, paralysed by his indecision. The world around him seemed to blur into a haze, his thoughts spiralling deeper into confusion. How could he make a choice? But in the end there would be no more time for hesitation. The moment would come, and Idomeneus would have to face it. The gods, as ever, would have their way. And though Idomeneus had always been a man of resolve, it was this moment, this choice, that would define the rest of his life. The shores of Crete had never seemed so distant, and yet the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. Idomeneus stood at the prow of his ship, staring at the land that was once his sanctuary. He had been to battlefields, faced enemies, and survived countless hardships, but none of it had prepared him for the cruel test that awaited him on these very shores. The first living thing he saw would have to be sacrificed just as he had promised the gods in exchange for the survival of his fleet. As the ships docked, the men of Crete rushed to disembark, eager to return to their families, to the peace that had long eluded them. But for Idomeneus, the celebration felt hollow. The men rejoiced, but the king stood frozen in place, his feet as heavy as stone. He could feel the weight of his vow like a suffocating blanket, pressing down on him with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. His mind raced with the images of his daughter, the sweet face of Hippodamia, the child he had sworn to protect. But the gods had demanded their price, and fate had already been set into motion. The promise had been made, and the moment of reckoning had come. Idomeneus's heart pounded as he stepped off the ship, his eyes scanning the shores, looking for the first living thing to cross his path. It was almost cruel how ordinary the world seemed in that moment. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the waves lapped gently against the shore, as if nature itself had no idea that the king was about to make a choice that would forever alter the course of his life. And then he saw her. Through the crowd of soldiers and villagers, The figure of Hippodamia emerged, her joyful face lighting up as she rushed toward him. Her laughter, once a comforting melody, now struck Idomeneus like a thunderclap. The first living thing he saw was his own daughter, the child he had promised to protect, the child whose love and devotion had been his guiding light through all the battles, all the struggles. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, unaware of the storm brewing in her father's heart. She reached out her arms to him, calling his name with the innocent trust only a child could have. "Father, you're home." For a moment, Idomeneus' resolve wavered. He looked at her, his beloved daughter, and felt an overwhelming rush of emotion. Love, guilt, and horror all mingled together. He wanted to run, to sweep her up in his arms and tell her everything was going to be okay. But in that instant, he was struck by the undeniable truth. He had made a vow to the gods. His word was the one thing he could not break. The gods had demanded a sacrifice, and he had no choice but to fulfill it. The weight of his duty, his honor, and his commitment to his people crushed him, and in that moment he understood the true cost of what he had promised. It wasn't just a sacrifice of life, it was the sacrifice of everything he held dear. Idomeneus knelt before Hippodamia, his hands trembling as he looked into her innocent eyes. "My dear child," he whispered, his voice choked with sorrow, "I have failed you, but the gods have spoken, and I must fulfill my vow." Before she could understand the full gravity of his words, before she could question the meaning of his grief, he raised his sword. The gods had demanded blood, and Idomeneus, in his blind obedience, delivered it. The world seemed to collapse around him in that moment. As the life drained from Hippodamia's eyes, Idomeneus felt as though a part of himself had died with her. The gods may have spared his fleet, but at what cost? He had fulfilled his vow, but in doing so, he had lost the very thing that made him human, his compassion, his love, his soul. The sound of the sacrifice echoed in the silent air, and the joyous celebration that had once filled the air turned into a haunting quiet. Idomeneus stood over his daughter's lifeless body, unable to comprehend the enormity of what he had done. His soldiers, who had cheered him as a leader and a hero, now looked at him with eyes full of fear and confusion. They did not understand the burden he had carried. They did not understand the weight of the gods' demand. But the look in their eyes told Idomeneus all he needed to know. He had just become a monster in their eyes. The gods may have spared his fleet, but Idomeneus' sacrifice had come at the ultimate cost. His kingdom, once a beacon of prosperity, was now tainted by the blood of the innocent. The people of Crete could never look at him the same way again. They would never forgive him for the monstrous act he had committed in the name of duty and honor. The days following the sacrifice were filled with a deafening silence. The celebration of victory that had once rang through the streets of Crete now felt like a distant memory, drowned out by the crushing weight of Idomeneus' decision. As the men of Crete returned to their homes, their families and their lives, the king remained alone in the palace, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he had done. Idomeneus' once bright future, marked by his leadership in the Trojan War, had now become a shadow of its former self. His soldiers, once loyal and eager to follow his command, now avoided his gaze. The kingdom, which had looked to him as a protector, now whispered behind his back, fearful of the man who had slaughtered his own flesh and blood in the name of duty. His royal lineage, once a source of pride, became a reminder of his failure. The man who had once been known for his courage and leadership was now known as the king who had sacrificed his daughter to the gods. As he sat alone in his grand hall, Idomeneus realized the cost of his decision. The gods had not rewarded him with peace or triumph. They had given him only emptiness. His kingdom was no longer a place of prosperity. It was a kingdom haunted by his own actions. The people of Crete, who had once adored him, now looked upon him with fear and revulsion. His very name had become a curse. But there was no escaping the truth. Idomeneus had fulfilled his vow to the gods, and in doing so, had lost everything. He had sacrificed the one thing he had sworn to protect. His daughter. There was no redemption in his future, no solace to be found in the praises of his people. The gods had played their part, but now they had moved on, leaving Idomeneus to face the consequences alone. For days Idomeneus wandered the halls of his palace, a shadow of the man he once was. He could not bear to face his people, and his thoughts were consumed by the image of his daughter's lifeless body. Every step he took felt like a betrayal of her memory, and yet there was no going back. He had made his choice, and the price of that choice was steep. In time, Idomeneus made the painful decision to leave Crete. Exile, he realized, was the only way to escape the weight of his own guilt. There was no place for him in the kingdom he had once ruled. He could not bear the looks of disgust from his people, nor could he live with the knowledge that his actions had tainted the very land he had sworn to protect. So, he took one final look at the palace, the symbol of his past glory, and left it behind. As he sailed into the unknown, Idomeneus felt the burden of his past slowly begin to ease, but the price of his redemption was clear. His legacy would be one of tragedy. He would never be remembered as the hero of Troy, the king who led Crete to victory. Instead, he would be remembered as the king who sacrificed his own daughter for the sake of a vow, a man whose honour became his downfall. But even in his exile, Idomeneus did not escape the grasp of the gods. Some say he wandered the shores of distant lands, never finding peace. Others say he returned to Crete briefly, only to find the kingdom in ruins, a reflection of the ruin he had brought upon it. However, the final chapters of his life are lost to history, overshadowed by the tragedy of his actions. Still, his story remains. It is a tale of a king who sought to honour the gods, only to find that the cost of such honour was far greater than he had ever imagined. His legacy, like so many others in Greek mythology, is one of both greatness and ruin, a reminder that the gods, for all their promises, may demand more than even the bravest heroes can bear. As the years passed, the legend of Idomeneus faded into the shadows of history, a distant memory eclipsed by the louder tales of other Greek heroes. Yet, like all great tragedies, his story continued to linger in the hearts of those who remembered the price of blind duty and unflinching honour. Idomeneus, the once proud king of Crete, became a symbol, not of greatness, but of the catastrophic consequences of a leader's actions when weighed down by impossible vows. In some versions of his myth, Idomeneus returns to Crete in his final years, a man broken by the ghosts of his past. The palace where he had once ruled with confidence now seemed like an alien place to him, and the people of Crete who had once adored him could not look past the blood that stained his hands. His exile, which had seemed like a release at first, only deepened his sense of isolation. Idomeneus was no longer a king. He was a wandering figure, lost in the vastness of his own guilt, unable to reclaim the life he had thrown away. There are others who suggest a more poetic end, that Idomeneus sailed from Crete, never to return, wandering the seas in search of redemption that would never come. In this version, he becomes a tragic figure, a king whose own sense of honour had led him into a self-imposed exile, where the price of his actions remained with him to the very end. It is said that he lived out his final days in sorrow, contemplating the actions that had taken the most precious thing from him, his daughter, and that, in his solitude, he became a symbol of the human condition, the conflict between duty and love, the burden of sacrifice, and the cost of promises made in desperation. No matter how his final years are told, one thing is certain. Idomeneus' legacy remains one of loss, not glory. His name is not remembered as that of a heroic king who led his people to victory or even a wise ruler who brought prosperity to Crete. Instead, he is remembered as a man who was undone by his own sense of duty, a king who made the ultimate sacrifice only to lose his soul in the process. In the grand tapestry of Greek myth, where gods, heroes, and mortals intertwine, Idomeneus' story is a stark reminder of the fragility of even the mightiest men. His tragedy lies not in his battlefield victories, which were numerous, or his status as a leader among the Greeks. His tragedy lies in the depths of his moral struggle, in the hollow promises he made to the gods, and in the irrevocable loss he endured. The gods may have spared his fleet, but they did not spare his heart. His myth is often recounted as a cautionary tale for kings, warriors, and those who would risk their souls in the name of duty. It teaches that the pursuit of honour, when taken to extremes, can destroy everything one holds dear. Idomeneus, for all his courage and nobility, was a man who lost everything not in battle, but in the quiet corners of his conscience. And though the warriors who followed him may have looked to him for guidance, they would never forget the tragic price he paid for his commitment to the gods. Ultimately, Idomeneus' legacy is not one of grandeur, but one of caution. His name is etched not in the marble halls of glory, but in the ruins of his kingdom, the ruins of his heart. And as the centuries passed, his tale would remain a testament to the fragility of human nature, the tension between duty and love, and the unforgiving consequences of promises made in the heat of desperation. There's a saying in the ancient world that goes something like this: the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And if anyone embodied this idea in Greek mythology, it was Ajax the Lesser, a man of towering strength, endless pride, and a reputation as one of the fiercest warriors of the Trojan War. But, as we'll see, for all his might, Ajax the Lesser wasn't exactly the sharpest sword in the sheath. You see, Ajax wasn't just any warrior. No, he was big, physically imposing with the kind of muscles that could probably split a tree in half with a single punch. When he walked into a room, you'd probably notice him before anyone else. But as is often the case with people who stand out, Ajax wasn't just a man of impressive stature. He had an ego to match. Some of the other Greek heroes had earned their renown through cleverness, Odysseus, sheer will, Achilles, or in the case of Agamemnon by being the guy who insisted on having everyone call him king. But Ajax, well, Ajax had earned his name by being really good at hitting things. Now, to be fair, his size and strength were no small feat. Ajax the Lesser, unlike his more famous counterpart Ajax the Greater, was known for his incredible speed and agility on the battlefield. Where the other Ajax, the massive, nearly indestructible force, was a true physical powerhouse, the lesser Ajax was quick and nimble, able to dart around with an almost surprising grace for someone built like a walking mountain. He was the kind of guy who could dart into the heart of the battle, swing his sword a few times, and then dash out before anyone could even get a good look at his shiny armour. Unfortunately for him, this tendency to be a bit too quick for his own good often got him into situations he probably should have avoided. But it wasn't just his physical prowess that made Ajax the Lesser stand out. It was his moral compass, which for all his bravado, wasn't always pointing in the right direction. Like many heroes of the time, Ajax was caught in the whirlwind of Greek hubris, that nasty little trait where gods and men alike believe they're invincible, and that everything in life revolves around their own glory. Ajax's claim to fame really came with his role in the Trojan War, where he was a vital part of the Greek forces. He wasn't the leader, but he was definitely a key player in the whole "let's sack Troy" business. There was no way the Greeks could have taken the city without him. He was fast, skilled, and made sure that everyone knew it. In fact, Ajax had one particular gift. He was known for his ability to throw a spear with lethal precision, a skill that earned him quite the reputation on the battlefield. But his Achilles' heel, pardon the pun, was his overwhelming confidence. You know the type. The guy who thinks he's untouchable and consequently makes choices that aren't always the smartest. This, of course, leads him to the type of situations where even gods sit back and go, "Oh, this is going to be good." As far as Trojan war warriors went, Ajax the Lesser had one thing that most of the other Greek heroes lacked: speed. While Achilles would charge in, cutting down enemies with godlike fury, and Odysseus would craft elaborate schemes to outwit the Trojans, Ajax wasn't one for subtlety. He wasn't exactly the brains of the operation, but when it came to charging headfirst into battle, he was top-notch. And if you needed someone to spear a guy with extreme precision while making it look effortless, Ajax the Lesser was your man. At the outset of the war, Ajax the Lesser quickly became known for his quick, almost acrobatic style of combat. Where most of the other Greek warriors relied on brute force, Ajax used his agility and lightning-fast reflexes to wreak havoc. He had an uncanny ability to move through the ranks of the Trojans, darting in and out of battle like some kind of mythical pinball. His speed made him a difficult target, and he often took out enemies before they even realized he was there. However, Ajax's rise wasn't just about his speed or his deadly aim. Like most Greek heroes, he had his pride, and as his reputation grew, so did his ego. He quickly began to see himself as an indispensable member of the Greek forces. "Without Ajax, we're doomed," he would joke, or not so jokingly, with his fellow warriors. And to be fair, his deeds spoke for themselves. He was instrumental in several key battles, charging into the heart of the action and securing critical victories. He had a particular knack for going after the Trojans' weakened or unsuspecting soldiers, picking them off one by one with a level of efficiency that would make even the gods nod in approval. Yet there was something about Ajax's approach to war that irked some of the other warriors. He often seemed to think he was the reason the Greeks were winning. His lack of humility, paired with his desire for personal glory, didn't sit well with many of the other leaders, particularly Agamemnon, who had to deal with his own struggles to maintain control over the Greek forces. While Achilles could at least be reasoned with sometimes, Ajax the Lesser was all about proving his own worth, and he wasn't shy about reminding everyone around him of that fact. But in the thick of the battle, these petty quarrels took a backseat to one thing: getting the job done, and Ajax did that in spades. Whether it was breaking through Trojan defences or securing key positions in the siege of Troy, Ajax's speed and skill made him one of the more reliable warriors among the Greeks. He was particularly useful in raids, moving quickly under the cover of night to disrupt Trojan camps or steal supplies. His agility allowed him to operate almost like a ghost in the chaos of the war. His most notable contribution came during the death of Patroclus. When Achilles, stricken with grief and rage after the death of his dear friend, refused to fight, Ajax was one of the leaders who stepped up to lead the charge. His role during this pivotal moment was crucial. He helped rally the Greek forces to push back the Trojans and ultimately buy enough time for Achilles to re-enter the fight. Ajax's leadership and bravery in this moment were pivotal to the Greek effort, but it also set the stage for something far more disastrous: Ajax's pride. As he continued to prove himself in battle, Ajax became one of the war's most celebrated warriors, but it was his arrogance that would eventually lead to his downfall. With each victory, he believed more and more that he was invincible, that his name would be forever etched in the annals of Greek legend. And why not? He was quick, he was deadly, and in his mind no Trojan was a match for his might. If there's one thing that the gods love, it's a good tragic irony. And when it came to Ajax the Lesser, they certainly weren't going to miss the chance to teach him a lesson. Ajax, for all his talent and pride, had grown so certain of his invincibility that he failed to realize one simple truth: the gods can be real party poopers when it comes to human pride. The turning point came after the Greeks had finally breached the walls of Troy, and the city was all but theirs. The Trojans, broken and desperate, were on the defensive, and victory was within reach. Ajax had fought valiantly throughout the war, and now, with the city falling, his ego was soaring to new heights. He felt invincible. He had done it all. He'd fought the hardest, led the charge, and had earned his glory. What more could a hero like him want? Surely he would be the one to claim the spoils of war and ensure his name would be remembered forever. Enter the spoils of war, specifically the armour of Achilles. When Achilles was killed by Paris, it was clear that his armour would become a symbol of great prestige. It was more than just a set of armour. It was a divine relic, the very symbol of the might of the Greeks' greatest warrior. It was the ultimate prize. Whoever claimed it would forever be seen as the rightful heir to Achilles' glory. The Greeks, ever eager for spoils, decided that the armour would be awarded to either Odysseus or Ajax, two of the most important and respected warriors on their side. Now, Odysseus, though a brilliant tactician, was not known for his physical prowess. Ajax, on the other hand, was. He had all the qualities that seemed to make him the perfect candidate for the prize: strength, honour, and, let's be honest, his ego was so large that he probably thought the armour had his name engraved on it. But when the armour of Achilles was awarded, the decision did not go to Ajax. It went to Odysseus. Why? Because Odysseus had proven himself in a way that Ajax simply could not. While Ajax had charge after charge, Odysseus had won the favour of the gods with his cunning and wit. He had outsmarted the Trojans with the famous Trojan horse, proving that sometimes brains win over brawn. Ajax was furious. This wasn't just a slight to his honour, it was a public humiliation. The gods, in their divine wisdom, had chosen the cunning Odysseus over the mighty Ajax, and the news hit him like a sword to the chest. But Ajax wasn't one to take defeat quietly. His pride burned with fury, and he could not accept that the armour he thought was rightfully his would go to anyone else. Driven by rage and a sense of betrayal, Ajax the Lesser decided to take matters into his own hands. That night he snuck into the Greek camp, intent on killing Odysseus and reclaiming the armour for himself. His plan was simple. If he couldn't have the armour through honour, he would simply take it by force. But as he crept into the night, a strange thing happened. The gods, who had been watching his every move, decided to have a little fun at his expense. In a twist of divine irony, the gods made Ajax think he was attacking Odysseus's men. He went into a frenzy, slaying anyone he encountered, but not Odysseus. In fact, the men Ajax killed weren't Greek at all. They were his own comrades. His rage, his thirst for vengeance blinded him to the reality of his actions. By the time he realized what had happened, it was too late. He had killed the very soldiers he had fought beside. The next morning, Ajax woke to the horrific realization of what he had done. He had betrayed his own people, all in the name of his misplaced pride. There was no going back from this. The honor he sought was now lost forever. No one could respect a man who had slaughtered his comrades out of sheer arrogance. Devastated and overwhelmed with guilt, Ajax the Lesser realized that his great fall had come not because of his strength, but because of his hubris, his refusal to accept that the gods had a hand in shaping his fate. Pride, the one thing he had always relied on, had become his undoing, and in that moment he knew that no matter how many battles he won, his legacy would now be forever stained by the deaths of his own men. After the bloodshed in the camp, Ajax the Lesser stood alone, surrounded by the ghosts of his actions. The great warrior who had once been feared and respected now found himself stripped of the very honor that had driven him. He had taken life, not in battle where he had always excelled, but in a blind fury fueled by his own ego. He had slain his own comrades, men who had fought alongside him through thick and thin. The weight of their deaths pressed down on him like a stone, and the reality of what he had done began to sink in. For the first time in his life, Ajax the Lesser felt the full weight of his pride, the same pride that had once propelled him to the front lines, that had made him the fearsome warrior he had been. But now his pride felt like an anchor, dragging him deeper into despair. He was no longer the hero who had struck terror into the hearts of the Trojans. He was the man who had murdered his own people in his quest for glory. His mind raced with a mix of regret, shame, and self-loathing. As the Greeks learned of Ajax's actions, the response was immediate and unforgiving. The warriors, who had once cheered his name on the battlefield, now turned away from him, their faces clouded with disbelief and anger. Achilles, even in his absence as he had already withdrawn from the war, had earned more respect than Ajax ever could at that moment. Ajax's name, once spoken with reverence, was now whispered with a sense of unease. He had become the very thing he had fought so hard to avoid, a disgrace. Even the gods who had watched the events unfold seemed to pass judgment on him. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, had always been a supporter of Ajax's bravery, but now she could not ignore the depths to which his pride had taken him. Zeus, the king of the gods, may have respected warriors like Ajax, but even he knew that pride could destroy the greatest heroes. As Ajax wandered the battlefield plagued by his conscience, he could hear the voices of his fallen comrades calling to him. They were not just the voices of the dead, they were the voices of his own guilt. "Why did you do it?" they seemed to ask. "Why did you kill us?" But Ajax did not have an answer. There was no justification for what he had done. The gods had given him no punishment because he had already given himself the greatest punishment of all. He had lost his honor. His pride had been his greatest weapon, but now it had turned against him, leaving him empty, hollow, and broken. The Greeks, in their judgment of him, decided that Ajax's actions could not go unpunished. The prize of the armour of Achilles, which he had fought so fiercely to claim, was ultimately awarded to Odysseus, and it was now a symbol of all Ajax had lost. In a final, desperate attempt to reclaim his honour, Ajax made a fateful decision. He would take his own life. In his mind, the only way to redeem himself was through death, a death that would wash away his guilt and restore the honour he had once held so dear. But as he prepared to end his life, something else began to stir in him, a moment of clarity. He realized that death, while it might cleanse his soul in the eyes of the gods, would not erase his mistakes. His pride, his arrogance, his fatal flaw, those were things he could never undo. He could not take back the lives he had destroyed, and no matter how he ended his life, his legacy would be forever tainted. The war was over, Troy had fallen, but Ajax the Lesser had already lost. As Ajax the Lesser stood on the precipice of his fate, he could feel the weight of the entire Trojan war pressing down on him. His mind swirled with guilt, rage, and despair as he looked upon the battlefield that had once been a place of glory and honour. Now it felt like nothing more than a graveyard of his mistakes, a place where heroes had died for causes they believed in, and where Ajax himself had been consumed by the very pride that had once defined him. The gods had turned their eyes away from him, their favour no longer granted. Athena, who had once watched over his victories, now seemed to mock him, as though to say, "You brought this upon yourself, Ajax." His honour, the very thing he had fought for, was shattered beyond repair. His attempt to reclaim it by killing Odysseus and taking the armour of Achilles had backfired in the most catastrophic way possible. He had slaughtered his own men, and in the end his enemies were left untouched. He had been reduced from the mighty hero of Troy to a man who couldn't even stand in the light of his own glory. In a final fit of rage and confusion, Ajax made his way to a secluded spot near the Greek camp, his sword in hand. The gods, who had orchestrated so much of his downfall, had left him with no escape but his own death. His desire to regain his honour and prove his worth to the gods had turned into an obsession, and now he saw no way out. He knelt, gazing at the sword in his hands, reflecting on the men he had killed, his own brothers in arms, the soldiers who had followed him through countless battles. He had murdered them without thinking, driven by a sense of entitlement and pride. How could he face them now in the afterlife? In his madness, Ajax the Lesser believed that death was the only solution, that his end would bring the redemption he so desperately sought. But the gods, having watched his descent into folly, had one final twist in store for him. Just as he was about to strike the fatal blow, the goddess Athena, ever the trickster, intervened. She clouded Ajax's mind further, twisting his perceptions until he no longer saw the Greek warriors around him. Instead, he believed he was slaying his enemies. His sword crashed down again and again, but it wasn't the Trojans he killed. It was his own comrades, his brothers in arms who had returned victorious from Troy. When the madness cleared, Ajax found himself surrounded by the bodies of his fallen friends, men who had fought beside him in the siege of Troy. His own actions had destroyed them, and he was left standing among the wreckage of his pride and hubris. The realization hit him with the force of 1,000 ships. He had become the monster he had always feared. His soul, once driven by honour and glory, was now stained by the blood of the very men he had sworn to protect. And in the midst of his despair, Ajax realized there was only one thing left to do. With no hope left, Ajax fell on his sword, a death he believed would restore his honour. His body was found by the Greeks, and though there was mourning, it was tinged with guilt and shame, for Ajax had not died a hero's death. His end was the consequence of his unyielding pride, and though he had once been a warrior worthy of song, he was now a cautionary tale. The Greeks, despite their victory, could not forget the tragic figure of Ajax the Lesser, the hero who had been undone by his own pride and arrogance. In death, he became a symbol of the danger of hubris, a warning that even the greatest warriors could be broken by their own egos. When the Trojan War ended, and the Greeks sailed back to their homeland, the victorious warriors returned not as heroes, but as men burdened with the weight of the gods' games, the consequences of their own actions, and the toll of a war that had claimed so many lives. Among them was Ajax the Lesser, whose death, though significant, was one that left behind more questions than answers. In the years following his tragic demise, the story of Ajax the Lesser became one that Greek mothers would whisper to their children, not as a tale of glory, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the mightiest warrior can be undone by their own arrogance. His name was spoken not in song, but in hushed tones, for his legacy was not the stuff of heroes. It was the legacy of a man who was far too full of himself to see the path that the gods had laid out for him. His tale was one of great promise, but also of great ruin. When word of his suicide reached Sparta, the reaction was one of sorrow, but also of profound discomfort. Menelaus, who had fought beside Ajax and watched him rise to glory on the battlefield, could not bring himself to mourn the man who had slaughtered his own comrades. Instead, he stood in silence, the weight of Ajax's actions hanging between them. How could the Greeks celebrate a man who had died so disgracefully? How could they honour a warrior who had killed his brothers in arms out of pride and vengeance? In his final moments, Ajax had hoped to restore his honour, to find redemption in death. But the gods, as they so often did, denied him that. His death did not purify him. It only deepened the stain of his arrogance. The divine punishment was not immediate, but it was felt in the legacy Ajax left behind. The gods had turned their backs on him, and his death only cemented their judgment. Athena, who had once favoured Ajax, could not help but shake her head at his fate. She had seen it all unfold, the warrior's rise, his arrogance, his blind rage. She had watched as he thought himself invincible, only to fall prey to the very flaw that had undone so many before him. Hubris, the pride that led mortals to believe they could control their own fate, was Ajax's true downfall. Such is the price of hubris, Athena would say, though no one was left to listen. Yet despite his tragic end, Ajax the Lesser was not forgotten entirely. His name would still be remembered, but not in the same way as heroes like Achilles or Odysseus. He was not remembered for his brilliance in battle, but for the humbling lesson he left behind. His was a legacy not of triumph, but of tragic wisdom. He had been the victim of his own pride, and in his fall the Greeks learned that even the greatest warriors could be undone by the very flaw that made them great. As for Helen, who had once been the spark of the war and the cause of so much bloodshed, she lived on with Menelaus in Sparta. Their reunion, though tainted by the war, was one of quiet reflection. Menelaus, who had seen firsthand the cost of pride and loss, did not speak of Ajax often, but he did not forget him. He understood that in war there were no true victors, only those who survived the chaos and those who succumbed to it. Ajax's legacy was not one of glory. It was a lesson, and a painful one at that. His life and death served as a warning to the Greeks, reminding them that no matter how strong or skilled they were, the gods could turn on them at any moment. Ajax the Lesser would be remembered not as the mighty hero of Troy, but as the tragic figure who learned too late that pride comes before the fall, and that even the most powerful warrior can be brought low by his own arrogance. Though the Trojan War had ended, Ajax the Lesser's legacy continued to ripple through the annals of Greek myth. His tale was one of caution, a grim reminder that no matter how strong, swift or skilled a man may be, the gods always have the final word. For the warriors who followed in his wake, the story of Ajax was one they would hear often, not as a tale of heroic triumph, but as a tragic lesson about the dangers of unchecked pride. In the years following his death, the Greeks would remember Ajax not for his victories, but for the bitter consequences of his arrogance. His story became a cornerstone of their understanding of hubris, the belief that mortals could stand equal to the gods. Ajax the Lesser had thought himself untouchable, and in doing so he had sealed his fate. His story was told by bards in the great halls of Greece, not as a tale of glory, but as a warning to the next generation of warriors. Pride, the bards would say, is a fire that burns brightest in the strongest warriors, and the gods will not let it go unchecked. But Ajax's legacy was not just one of doom. The Greeks recognized that, like all heroes, his story was complex, a mixture of bravery, recklessness and tragic flaws. His courage in battle had been undeniable. His quick thinking on the battlefield had saved many Greek lives, and his actions during the Trojan War were not to be forgotten. Ajax the Lesser had been a hero in his own right, fierce, unyielding and determined. Yet his fatal flaw, his inability to reconcile with the gods and his overwhelming desire for personal glory, had led him to a tragic end. Even Helen, who had been at the heart of the war, and who had witnessed the effects of Ajax's pride firsthand, carried a heavy heart as she reflected on the cost of it all. After all, it was her beauty, which had sparked the war, that had brought all these heroes to Troy. She lived with the knowledge that her actions, though never intended to start a war, had led to the downfall of so many men, and Ajax, in many ways, had been one of the greatest of these tragic figures. While she was with Menelaus, her thoughts often turned to the men who had fallen and the sacrifices they had made, Ajax included. His pride, in her eyes, had taken him from a hero to a cautionary tale. The great warrior who once charged into battle with the fury of a lion had ended his life with the futility of a man who could not accept his own flaws. For those who came after Ajax, his story remained a solemn reminder of the dangers of hubris. The Greeks, who had always revered their heroes, understood that greatness came not just from victory, but from the ability to accept one's limitations. The story of Ajax the Lesser was woven into their culture as both a symbol of what could be achieved and a warning of what could be lost. No one was immune from the gods' judgment, and even the mightiest heroes could fall. In the grand tapestry of Greek mythology, where the gods were as capricious as they were powerful, Ajax the Lesser would be remembered as one of the tragic figures whose actions were shaped by their inner demons. His pride may have propelled him to greatness, but it was his downfall that truly defined him. Ajax's legacy was not written in the blood of the Trojans he killed, or the victories he claimed, but in the lesson he left behind. Even the greatest heroes must remain humble before the gods, for it is pride that leads to a hero's ultimate fall.